Antes da gente apresentar o palestrante, eu queria avisar uma coisa. A gente está apostando numa palestra em inglês. O palestrante é um palestrante que fala a língua inglesa, não fala português. A nossa proposta, em vez de ficar interrompendo ele para fazer uma tradução aqui o tempo todo, a nossa proposta é que, como a palestra está sendo gravada e vai estar disponível para vocês no YouTube, que a gente se comprometa a legendar a palestra no YouTube. Tá? E aqui a experiência de vocês é uma experiência que a gente está propondo que seja internacional, num idioma que não é o idioma de ninguém aqui, mas o palestrante está preferindo isso e está dizendo que a palestra tem muitas imagens incríveis, então assim dá para entender o que vai ser dito. Tudo bem? Podemos fazer assim? Senão vai ser o dobro do tempo que a gente vai precisar. E aí acho que vai todo mundo ficar cansado no final. Podemos fazer assim? Ok. Obrigado.
Bom dia a todos e todas, né? Eu vou convidar os participantes a virem para a mesa aqui e então assim, uma grande satisfação ver esse auditório cheio, né? Esse evento que tem sido um sucesso essa semana toda, né? E espero que vocês tenham aproveitado bastante. Então eu vou convidar os participantes a estarem aqui na mesa, tá bom? Começo.
Vai dar ficarem aqui, não vão assistir. Talvez chamamos depois. Calma.
Ah, tá. Tá bom. Pode ser. Tá, então o Guilherme está sugerindo o seguinte, da gente ficar sentado aí mesmo e só o professor Thomas Daniell vir para cá. Então a gente depois vem para cá, tá bom? Então, vou convidar então o professor Thomas Daniell. Please, I would like to have you here, please. We're gonna watch the presentations from there, and then after your presentation, we can come here. Okay? You need then how is it? I'm fine. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize. I don't speak Portuguese.
It's something there.
First of all, I want to say I'm very happy to be here. What a beautiful city. What an amazing architecture school. You are very privileged to study in this building with these beautiful gardens and in this beautiful city. I first of all want to thank Professor Guillaume Lassance for arranging the invitation, and to thank Guillaume and Patricia Lassance for being such wonderful hosts. And I also want to thank the committee or the Institute for Architecture and Urbanism, who have partly subsidized my visit. It's great to be here. It's my first time in Brazil, but it won't be my last time in Brazil. So today, I want to give an overview of, a very fast overview of developments in Japanese architecture from the period after the Second World War until the present day, to show the evolution and refinement of certain themes and ambitions. I will now speak more slowly, but to show a kind of cyclical repetition of responses to certain outside events. As you probably know, Japan at the end of World War II was devastated. The major cities of Japan had been firebombed. Only the stone and masonry buildings were surviving. There was incredible devastation and incredible death, and of course, death, and of course, 2 of Japan's cities had been attacked by nuclear weapons and completely obliterated. There was not enough food, and there was not enough housing. But the nation recovered quickly. Initially, it recovered under 7 years of an Allied occupation, which was effectively an American occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur. Now, this was a time of major architectural and urban projects for reconstructing all of the cities that had been destroyed. And at that time, due to the lack of housing, the repatriation of people from Japan's Pacific Empire, there was not enough land. So there were some serious proposals to expand Tokyo into Tokyo Bay, to reclaim land from the bay to build housing, offices, hospitals, schools, and a new airport. So in 1958, the president of the Japan Housing Corporation, Hisa Akira Kano, proposed filling in half of Tokyo Bay to create all of this new land. In 1959, he made a second version where there were platforms of new land, including a large island in the middle of the bay for a new international airport. Now, these ideas were very exciting for the young architects of Japan who began to make their own proposals. For example, the same year, the young architect Masato Otaka designed his version of an expansion into Tokyo Bay. There was no client, he had no money, he just did it because he thought it was interesting. Now, the following year, 1960, there was a major architecture-related event held in Tokyo, the World Design Conference, 1960. It was called the World Design Conference. It included designers of every type, but it was dominated by architects, including international guests that included Paul Rudolph, Louis Kahn, Jean Prouvé, and Allison and Peter Smithson. It was also the debut of a group of younger architects who called themselves the Metabolists. Now, Kenzo Tange, an important Japanese architect who was basically in charge of organizing this event, he wanted young Japanese architects to have a presence, not just old famous architects. He wanted the young generation to show what they were doing. So he gathered a group of younger architects and finally chose 7 people. 4 of them were architects, Masato Otaka, who I already mentioned, Kiyonori Kikutake, Fumihiko Maki, and Kisho Kurokawa. In addition to those 4 architects, there was a product designer, Kenji Ekoan, a graphic designer, Kiyoshi Awazu, and a writer, a critic, called Noboru Kawazoe. Arate Isozaki is often associated with the Metabolist, but he was not a member. He never joined. He never joined any groups, but somehow he was at the edge of this group. Now, all of these young architects had some similar ideas about growth and change, about seeing buildings and cities as living organisms that could evolve. And there were already some examples, built examples of these ideas, such as the Harumi Apartments in Tokyo, at the time the largest ever housing project in Japan, designed by Kunio Maekawa. Maekawa had worked with Le Corbusier in Paris in the 1920s and brought back the ideas of European modernism to Japan, together with his young assistant Masato Otaka, who I've already mentioned. So the building has 2 levels of structure. The major structure, in Maekawa's words, was a 3-story, 2-bay wide frame. You can see it if you look closely at the facade. There's the large mega frame, and within this large mega frame, the housing is constructed of wood that is somehow plugged into the concrete frame and could change over time. At a smaller scale, also completed in 1958, the Sky House by Kiyonori Kikutake, this was Kikutake's own home, was also an experiment in flexibility. So it's a simple square plan with a balcony or a corridor all around the periphery, lifted in the air on 4 wall pillars. And the interior fittings of this building were all mobile. Kikutake called these move nets, the kitchen, the storage, the bathroom, and so on, could be relocated. So over the decades, the planning of the house would change. And not only could you change the planning of the house, if you needed more space, for example, if a child was born, you could clip on a new bedroom to the underside of the main concrete slab, and when that child grew up and left home, you could either remove it or you could convert it to something else, a wine cellar perhaps. Now, At the same time Kikutake finished his house, he started work on a visionary urban project that he called Marine City, and he spent many years developing the Marine City, which was basically a set of floating platforms linked together, and on those floating platforms he placed cylindrical towers, primarily for housing, but also for other functions. So if you look at the cylinder towers, they're covered with small circles, and each one of those circles is a capsule, a living capsule, that clips onto the tower. It's kind of a self-contained vehicle. It's a house, but it's also something like a car or a spaceship. And these could be removed or changed or modified over time as necessary. So the young metabolists, they chose their name, and they collected all of their existing projects into a book that they called Metabolism 1960, with the subtitle The Proposals for New Urbanism. It's a 90-page book. They printed 500 copies, and they sold it in the lobby of the World Design Conference for 500 yen, which is a couple of euros. If you have a copy now, it's worth much, much more than that. So the book contained all of their ideas about the future of architecture and cities. They regarded the production of buildings and cities as analogous to natural cycles of growth, of decay, and of regeneration that required a constant replacement of parts. And this was exemplified by megastructural hybrids of architecture and urbanism, visionary cities in the air or over the sea that used the motif of a prefabricated inhabitable capsule, and that capsule was like a building block for these enormous, it was a container for miniaturized technologies, but a building block for enormous urban plans. So, following the World Design Conference, Tange, in his university studio, he started working on his own proposal for Tokyo Bay with some of his students, including, in the middle of this photo, Arata Isozaki, standing on the right, Kisho Kurokawa. And they developed a proposal that was basically an infrastructural system that spanned from the center of downtown Tokyo, in the top left of this photo, across the bay to the other side to a place called Chiba. And this was a set of elevated highways of interlocking loops, which fixed to which were lateral piers, like branches, and attached to those branches were small buildings that were metaphorically blossoms or leaves. The metaphor here was a tree, a growing tree. So this is an example of a megastructural system. There's a fixed frame, but the modules or the capsules, the smaller units, can be added or removed or changed over time. But in fact, if you zoom in and look at the building complexes within this project, they are megastructures within megastructures. Even these building complexes can be adapted and adjusted over time. So, Tange then presented this, I should say, these drawings here, beautiful drawings, were done by Arata Isozaki when he was working on this project for Kenzo Tange. So the idea was that this project obviously wouldn't be built all at once. It would happen in, let's say, 5-year increments, expanding across the bay. The diagrams at the top here are taken from a biology textbook to show the analogy with living cells growing. And it didn't have to remain a straight line. Eventually it would start to distort and branch and eventually cover all of Japan with a kind of web of linear cities. So Tange presented this on national television in January 1961. It was then published as a special issue of Japan Architect magazine, the entire issue, and finally as a self-contained book. And this made Tange the most famous architect in Japan and filled Japanese society, who are still recovering from the devastation of the war, with optimism about a bright science fiction, amazing technological future. So throughout the rest of the 1960s, the young metabolists, who had become immediately famous because of the World Design Conference, continued developing their ideas about visionary future cities. Kikutake spent at least 5 years making more models and variations of his marine city. In fact, he kept working on this for the rest of his life, on and off. He was asked to make an urban proposal for downtown Tokyo and a neighborhood called Ikebukuro, so he just relocated his marine city into the real city and put it on top. It was never built. Kisho Kurokawa, who was from a rural area in Aichi Prefecture in Japan, proposed an agricultural city. The idea was to build the architecture floating in the air in a grid system that could expand over time, leaving the agricultural land, the farmland, free as much as possible. And the living units themselves were metaphorically mushrooms that sprouted up from the ground and penetrated through the grid floating in the air. He later developed something he called the helix structure, which is also biological, but in this case based on the form of DNA molecules, which he used. This was a theoretical, conceptual project, but he used this as the basis for a real proposal for a small town called Kasumigaura, north of Tokyo, where the city began on the land, but expanded out into the water, creating a kind of lifestyle that was an interesting mixture of super high technology with kind of very retro traditional agricultural lifestyles. Kurokawa was, amongst all the metabolists, the one who was most interested in capsules. He thought metabolism was all about these high-tech capsules, one for each individual or couple or family. And he made a number of capsule proposals that he took to a very kind of high level of resolution. So his prefabricated apartment house used a megastructural system. There was a kind of a fixed frame with capsules that plug in. But the frame itself could also be changed and modified at a slower pace than the capsules themselves. Kenji Ekoan, who was a product designer, showed the way that metabolism really covered an extraordinary range of scales, from enormous city plans right down to the level of the single building, but almost to the level of product design. A building like this you could see as similar to a car or even a stereo, some piece of high-tech equipment. This was a ski lodge that you could put on the back of a truck and relocate whenever you found better snow somewhere else. You would move it. He also made a conceptual proposal for a city or a kind of a mini city that he called the dwelling city, based on a tetrahedral capsule unit that was a building block to create a larger tetrahedral city with the urban space, the public space in the hollow center, which could then be put on top of an existing city. Or many of them could be clustered on top of an existing city. Now, Arati Isozaki, who as I mentioned, never joined the Metabolists, but he designed some projects around this period that are now considered to be canonical, part of the Metabolist period. But in a certain sense, Isozaki's Metabolist projects were criticisms of what he saw as the problems with metabolism. He thought it was unreasonable to expect one architect to design an entire city. There are many other stakeholders who should also contribute to the design of a city. He also thought that the metabolists ignored the existing city. They just went out into the sea or up into the air, and they completely ignored the existing city. And he also thought that at a very deep level, the metabolists believed in endless growth. The population and the economy was always going to get bigger. So he wanted to criticize these things in a certain sense by showing how crazy metabolism was. So in his proposal that he called City in the Air, the key idea here is something he calls the joint core. The joint core is the cylinders you see, the vertical cylinders you see in this drawing. And the idea was you would find an open space in the existing city and put one of these cylinders there. And it contained vertical circulation, stairs, elevators, but also pipes and electrical wiring and so on. They would extend up into the air to the same height. then you would build bridge-like structures between them at the angles and lengths as dictated by the arrangement of joint cores. A couple of years later, he made a second version, also using the joint core concept, but in this case, they became something like trees. The joint core was the trunk of the tree that supported branches with the capsules attached to them, but the trees were not freestanding. At the tips of the branches, they might touch another branch, so in fact you could go up one joint core, across all the way through two branches, and then go down a different joint core. So it became more of a mesh or a rhizome-like system rather than individual trees. Now, Isozaki never built any of these joint core projects, but his teacher, Kenzo Tange, kind of stole the idea and used it for some of his projects, such as the Yamanashi Broadcasting and Press Center, where you can see obviously the joint core composition, where these tubes support the bridge elements that span between them, and each of the tubes contains, in most cases, a stair or lifts, but various other vertical infrastructural components. Or the Shizuoka Press and Broadcasting Tower in Tokyo, where a single joint core contains these cantilevered office volumes. So, 10 years after their debut in 1960, the Metabolists were given a chance to show what their ideas were really worth. They were given a national, or in fact a global stage at the World's Fair held in Osaka, known as Expo 70. This was the first World's Fair ever held in Asia, and it was the best attended World's Fair in history. 64 million people came to Osaka, and that record was not broken until 40 years later at the Shanghai Expo in 2010. Now, Japan had exhibited at World's Fairs in the past, in Europe and in America, but they always showed traditional Japan. Kimono and calligraphy and cherry blossoms and geisha and tea ceremonies. But Expo 70 was an opportunity to present a radically futuristic version of Japan through immersive art installations, through media art, through robotics and experimental architecture. Kenzo Tange was in charge of the master plan and used a similar idea to his Tokyo Bay project. The metaphor was the tree. There was a central trunk running vertically through this drawing, from which the paths were branches and then the pavilions were leaves or blossoms. And he brought in many of his former students and associates, including the Metabolists, to design elements of the expo, including the covered walkways and the cable cars. For example, Masato Otaka designed the entry platform where the monorail arrived from the airport. Kenji Ekoan designed the monorail itself and some of the street furniture. Kiyonori Kikutake designed the expo tower. And again, he tried to use the concept of the MoveNet. These icosahedron volumes look as if they can be removed and relocated. In fact, they couldn't. It was just the image of flexibility. They couldn't really be changed, but the concept was clear. Now, as well as all the national pavilions, there were many pavilions built by private companies, and they commissioned some of the Metabolists. For example, Kisho Kurokawa designed the Toshiba Pavilion. So the central orange volume is a multi-screen immersive cinema, and it's supported by a structural system that Kurokawa called the tetrapod, a custom designed system that was prefabricated and craned into place. He also designed a pavilion for a cosmetics company called Takara. He called this the Butylion, which looks as if it's being assembled or dismantled. Basically, there's a mega frame, again custom designed, into which the capsules are plugged in. And he collaborated on the interior with Kenji Ekoan, who designed the layout of TV monitors and the carpet-lined walls and so on. Now, in the center of the expo grounds, the trunk of the tree, was a strip known as the symbol zone, at the center of which were three main elements. There was the festival plaza, an event space, a performance space coordinated by Arata Isozaki. On top of that was the big roof designed by Kenzo Tange, and in the middle you can see the sculpture that's known as the Tower of the Sun, created by the artist Taro Okamoto. So the big roof was a space frame, a ball-jointed steel pipe structure, which is with its upper surface covered in air-filled pillows made of transparent polyester. It was assembled on the ground and then raised 30 meters in the air on hydraulic jacks. Now, Tange wanted to create a kind of amorphous cloud-like object. He was disappointed that it was a bit too rigid and grid-like and bulky. But it wasn't just a shelter. It was an inhabitable space frame, and many other architects plugged in capsules into the roof, a bit like Jona Friedman's City in the Air projects. Some of these capsules were designed by the Metabolist architects, some by international architects such as Hans Hollein and Archigram. The Festival Plaza was an open space for artistic performances and public encounters. The name was supposed to be understood as a combination of the Japanese notion of a festival, which was a seasonal parade through the streets of a city, and the European notion of a permanent plaza, like the Greek agora or the Roman piazza. So Isozaki was in charge of a team of composers and artists and computer experts who developed the programming of the plaza. And he installed movable stages and trolleys at the ground level and suspended sound and lighting equipment from the roof. And the idea was to turn Festival Plaza into a cybernetic environment based on feedback from the audience and the technology that would make it an interactive system, all coordinated from an enormous underground control center that you see here. So Isozaki also proposed two enormous robots, 14-meter-high robots that could move around the plaza, lifting things up and relocating them. They would create the kind of dynamic, cybernetic, flexible, evolving space of the plaza. So here is the entire system. Everything was mobile, lighting, sound, and so on. So the first robot was what he called a performance robot. It was fitted with cameras, microphones, speakers, spotlights, smoke machines, aroma nozzles, and extendable arms, and capped with two transparent globes for human operators. The other was what he called a sub-control station, which had a control room in its base or in its belly, and a platform for spotlights on top. And both of the robots could respond in real time to the changing conditions in the surroundings, the sound, the light, the air movement, and so on. They would send the data to the underground control room, and then all of the plaza technology could be controlled and managed from there. So, unfortunately, these robots broke down a couple of days after the expo opened, and they just became fixed lighting towers. But they're in every single photo shoot of the expo. Now, the artist Taro Okamoto was invited to make the theme pavilion of the expo. This is not a sculpture. It's actually a pavilion with that can be entered. And he called it the Tower of the Sun. So the Festival Plaza and the big roof was supposed to make a very neutral backdrop for the expo, for events. It wasn't supposed to be spectacular architecture. It was supposed to enable interesting events to happen. So Okamoto didn't like how neutral it was, and he wanted to make an aggressive contrast. Here he is explaining to Tange on the left what he wants to do. He said, I hate this neutral space frame grid. I want to penetrate it. My sculpture is not going to sit under the roof. It's going to poke a hole through the roof. symbolically and literally piercing the modern space frame grid. So the Tower of the Sun is here he is explaining it to Arata Isozaki, a 68-meter high cone with 25-meter long outstretched arms. Here he is building the 1:10 scale prototype in his studio. So it had 4 faces, the golden face at the top, a face on its belly, a face on its back, and an underground face. So it directly looked across the expo grounds to Kiyonori Kikutake's expo tower, and Okamoto said this was a kind of a showdown, a challenge between primitive and modern. So as I said, this was not just a sculpture. This was a pavilion you could enter. You enter in the basement level, and you start an exhibition about the evolution of life on Earth. In the basement, there was a display about the appearance of single-cell organisms in the early oceans of our planet, and then you would climb up through the jellyfish and the small fish, the lizards, the dinosaurs, the primates, and you finally got to the top, to the world of human beings. So Okamoto described his tower as an anti-expo monument. He was critical of many aspects of the expo, but rather than producing the shock effect that he hoped for, people just thought it was a cute mascot. They loved it, and Isozaki later said it was just bombastic kitsch. Now, Expo 70 was the culmination of metabolism as a movement, and in many ways, this was a turning point in the history of Japanese culture. This was the end of modernism and the beginning of postmodernism. The metabolists all went their separate ways. It was really only Kisho Kurokawa who continued to keep the faith, who continued to believe in capsules and in metabolism, and he made many proposals through the 70s for capsule-based settlements. Here is a capsule village. He developed a prototype together with one of Japan's housing companies. I think they were able to sell 2 of them. Metabolism really was a failure in terms of creating a future vision for Japanese cities. The only really significant overtly metabolist building ever built was Kurokawa's Nakagin Capsule Tower, completed in 1972, just after the expo, as piazza-terre, as small apartments for businessmen who had their main house outside the city. If they missed the last train, they had a place to stay. These were business capsules. And the idea was the capsule would contain everything you need for a bachelor life in the city with all of the latest technology. It was a tower, or in fact 2 towers, concrete towers, each with a lift and a stair wrapped around the lift onto which the capsules were clipped on with steel bolts. Here's Kurokawa looking proud at the completion of his building. So the planning of this building is very clever. Rather than a typical dogleg stair where you go up half a floor, there's a landing, you go up another half floor to the next level. In this case, the stairs are divided into 3 parts. So you see you go up 1/3 of a floor, there's a small landing, another 1/3 of a floor, another landing, then to the next level. And he attached capsules at each one of the landings, so all of the capsules are offset by 1/3 or 2/3 of a floor, giving a much greater variety in the external appearance of the building. Now, the metabolist concept was that these capsules could be removed, relocated, modified, changed over time. The building would evolve with the city. It never happened. The building was full of technology that quickly became out of date. Black and white televisions, reel-to-reel music players, and it fell into disrepair. The plumbing failed. For the last few years of the building's existence, there was no water, and eventually no hot water, then eventually no water at all. The spaces became filled with junk. They were turned into other functions. They were inhabited by people who had nowhere else to go. And some of them just became completely dilapidated. Oops. So in 2022, finally, after a lot of struggle, it was demolished. Now, there was a movement to try and have this building listed by Dokomomo, the Documentation and Conservation of Modern Movement Architecture. That failed, but it would have been the ultimate irony to make this a listed, preserved building. It would have gone everything that the metabolists believed architecture should be. I think 23 of the capsules were saved, were in condition that was good enough to save them. They were refurbished. They were converted into an art gallery in Tokyo. They were sold to various other collectors and museums around the world. Right now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, there's an exhibition about this building that includes one of the original capsules. Now, Arati Suzaki had a mental and emotional collapse at the end of the expo, and when he recovered, he completely denied all of the concepts he had been promoting with the expo, and he said he'd made a terrible mistake to try and propose a centralized control room for the expo. What was really needed was parallel processing, ubiquitous computing, a distributed computer network throughout a city. 2 years after the expo, the same year as the Nakagin building was completed, he proposed a computer-aided city. This was a real commission, it was never built, where everything in the city would be controlled by distributed smaller computers that had a bottom-up kind of emergent intelligence that would make sure the traffic, the plumbing, the water, the power, and so on all worked very smoothly. And he wrote an essay explaining this that he called soft architecture. Now, soft architecture here means software architecture. And he contrasted software to hardware. He said that hardware is the architecture of the past, software is the architecture of the future. Architecture should not be hard, physical, fixed things. It should be flexible, intangible, virtual things. About 25 years later, Isozaki was given another chance to think about all of his ideas about urbanism, metabolism, and the future of architecture. He was invited by a provincial government in China to master plan an entirely new city in the south part of Hanshin Island, near to Macau, across the bay from Hong Kong. And when he went to visit the site, it was a beautiful piece of open land, and it was going to have universities and research centers and high-tech manufacturing. He said, this landscape is too beautiful. Instead, we should build a new island out in the water and leave the landscape as it is. And he called this Mirage City. And he described it as, quote, a utopia, because a city on the sea evokes a world totally detached from contemporary political institutions and social conventions. So his intention was to avoid making any kind of rigid master plan. He wanted a flexible master plan where it wasn't just him making all of the decisions. So he used a kind of discontinuous method of layering many, many different ideas into the same piece of land. So each new layer would interfere with the previous layers, and the overall urban form would be a kind of interference pattern. So first of all, he looked at the feng shui of the area. He found the spine of a dragon in the mountain range and was able to set up some feng shui axes to create the basic form of the island. Then he looked at the original utopia, which is from a 16th century novel by Thomas More, who invented the word utopia, which shows an island off the mainland connected by 2 bridges. So he made 2 bridges. He then took the Forbidden City, the main palace complex in Beijing, overlaid it on his plan to create the central business district. He used a plan of Venice, particularly the public spaces and the locations of churches in Venice, and of course the Grand Canal, to create some variety and his own island. And then he used some very, very early primitive, this is 1994, algorithmic software to randomly or spontaneously generate patterns of street layouts and public spaces and maps of density. The idea was to stop it looking like one person had designed everything. And then having created this basic computer model, which I'm sure you'll all understand, looks like a 1995 wireframe computer model, this still wasn't random enough. So he then took Piranesi's Campo Marzio and he superimposed it on the island to divide the island into 48 blocks. And then he sent each one of these blocks to a friend of his somewhere in the world, a famous architect or a young, interesting architect, and said, design me a building for this site. But he didn't tell them what was on the sites around it. So it was kind of an experiment in random, surrealist urban composition. Then he exhibited all this in 1997 at a gallery in Tokyo, and as well as showing his ideas and the ideas of his friends he'd invited, he also asked 5 architects or artists to make their own proposals inside the gallery. And he also set up a primitive website. Nobody knew what a website was in 1997, where people all around the world could send their own suggestions for modifying the master plan of the island. Now, this was never built, but he was trying to create an urban design that was a platform for collaboration and for different voices to almost accidentally and spontaneously create a vision for a new city. So let's just return to the expo, to the end of the expo, and look again at the history of the shift from hardware to software. One of the people involved in the design of the expo was a very young, unknown architect called Toyo Ito. He was working for Kiyanori Kikutake, and he was part of the project team for the expo tower. When the expo ended, he decided he was going to make his own office that would be a new type of architecture that would be a combination of hardware and software. It would be a kind of IT architecture. And he called his office Urbot, which meant urban robot. He took the name from Kenzo Tange, and for the first 10 years of his practice, all of his buildings were called Urbots, urban robots. This is his first project, the aluminium house, the first thing he ever built for his brother-in-law. And then he made a series of conceptual projects, all called Urbots, where the idea was each family member of the house would have their own capsule within a larger shared space. So here you see the private living capsules set within the larger volume. There's a more radical version, where again the capsules each has their own skylight but no window, and then the bathroom and toilet are located at the end of these capsules on the left of this photo. So these are absurd ideas. The planning is absurd. It doesn't really work. In a sense, these are ways of showing the problems of metabolism and the reasons why you shouldn't make individuals live in their own small capsules. His third version, Urbot 3, was just this single photo collage with an essay where he describes the capsules having fallen off the buildings or escaped from the houses roaming around the streets of Tokyo. This was kind of a joke about metabolism gone wild. Ito's career truly begins with this house here, the White U, which he designed for his sister, completed in 1976. His sister had just lost her husband. He died of cancer. She was alone with 2 small children, and she wanted a place in which to grieve. So the house is almost like a tomb or a memorial. It's closed off from the city, and everything is focused on the central courtyard space. And Ito's way of composing the house was using what he called morphemes. Morphemes are analogous to phonemes in language. A phoneme is a sound that has no meaning in itself. So these elements have no architectural function in themselves, but they're ways of controlling light and motion, shadow and sound throughout the architectural interior. It was basically continuous tubular space, which the family, the 2 young daughters, could run around. And its only real relationship to the exterior was next to the dining area, where you have a larger window that opens onto the central courtyard, which at the beginning was an area of black earth, but over the decades eventually became overgrown and decayed. The house was later demolished when the time was right for the family. But before that happened, Ito built his own house right next to it. This was family land. They had 2 pieces of land. Ito's house, completed 8 years later, he called the Silver Hut. Now this was an opposite design. White-U was completely closed off from the city around it, but Silver Hut was completely open to the city. Ito was working with the potentials of new materials, of perforated metal, of aluminium skins, of translucent plastic, and he wanted to create an architecture that allowed the atmosphere of the city to enter the interior of the house. So this house was completed at the beginning of what's now known as the Japanese bubble economy. For the next 10 years, the Japanese economy went completely crazy. It became the wealthiest country in the world. Land in Tokyo was worth an absurdly high price, which made architecture worth not very much compared to the price of the land. So all kinds of interesting architectural experiments happened. Architecture became fashion. It was torn down, it was built and torn down very quickly. So Ito was interested in this, but also critical of it. And one of his most kind of interesting critical statements about the condition of life in late 1980s Tokyo was what he called the POW for the Tokyo Nomad Girl. This was the creation. This was created for an exhibition, and the idea was to create a new dwelling for, in this case, the young women of Tokyo. It was like a tent, a temporary artificial structure that contained almost nothing, just some pieces of furniture that allowed the young unmarried women of Tokyo to live their glamorous life in the restaurants and bars and nightclubs of the city around them. The project architect for this was Kazuo Sujima while she was working in Ito's office. You have a piece of furniture for putting on makeup, a piece of furniture for drinking tea, a piece of furniture for reading fashion magazines, and nothing else. The city gives you everything that you need. Ito later built a couple of structures that also reflect similar ideas about the craziness of life in Tokyo in this time. The Tower of the Winds is a kind of sculpture that sits on top of a subway station. It contained sensors that detected the quality of the air coming up from the vent below, its temperature, its speed, the sound it made, and its humidity. And these caused changes in the light patterns outside. So the invisible qualities of the atmosphere of Tokyo were being made visible. A second project that did something similar was the Egg of Winds, again a sculptural project, an egg shape made of perforated metal, which had video imagery projected on the skin from inside. Some of you will recognize this as a still from the film Blade Runner. The first one, the good one. And then in 1991, Ito produced an exhibition that encapsulated all of his ideas about the state of Tokyo during the bubble economy. He was asked to make an installation in London at a large exhibition called Visions of Japan about the future of Japanese cities. So he was given a gallery space and he didn't put anything in it. He lined the floor and the walls with glass and acrylic. He put some hidden slide projectors and movie projectors in the space, and the space was then filled with fast-changing imagery of Tokyo by night, together with a sound installation of Tokyo by night. And this got a lot of attention. Ironically, this appeared just at the moment that the bubble economy of Japan ended. And the Japanese economy went into a recession. So Ito then changed his approach. This was his proposal for the Sendai Mediatek, which was designed during the bubble, but then built after the bubble had finished. What was designed, just after the bubble had ended, was a proposal for a new type of public space for a kind of the virtual life of what he called modern-day cyborgs, people who are now spending half their time in the physical world and half their time in the virtual world. So this was the first first work of architecture for the age of the internet, let's say. The idea was to create a set of open flat plates, simple open floor plates, supported by a structural system that was as light and flexible as seaweed. So these cages that you see in this sketch are in fact open tubes, open cage tubes that penetrate the slabs of the building and give a kind of visual connection between the different layers inside the building. Now, although this was intended to be a kind of an example of virtual architecture, when Ito visited the construction site of this building and he saw the amount of steel, the amount of welding, the heat and the weight of everything involved, he thought, oh, I'm completely wrong. I shouldn't be making virtual architecture for cyborgs. Architecture is heavy and real. And the next phase of Ito's work was a return to what he called the new real in architecture. So rather than this kind of virtual floating spaces, he started, well, this is the construction site of that I mentioned, where he saw the amount of steel involved in creating these virtual spaces. The new real was a shift to look at heavy, opaque, thick, rough architecture based on principles taken from the natural world. An early example was the Green project in Fukuoka, a single concrete slab, all calculated using parametric design software to create completely even stress throughout the structure. So much like Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, where all of the catenary arches mean there is no compressive stress in the arches, this slab is a kind of non-linear version of the Sagrada Familia structure, where everything is contained within this single thickness of the slabs. There are no beams and no columns supporting the structure. And I think this idea reaches a really powerful resolution with his proposal for the Ghent Forum in Belgium, where the single surface is distorted to create all of the spaces within the architecture. This is as if it's one rubber sheet, in fact made of concrete, folded like a piece of coral, and a giant piece of coral to create the interior spaces. Ito lost the competition, sadly, but he was able to reuse the idea. A couple of years later, he entered a competition for an opera house in Taiwan. So rather than having this beautiful canal to respond to, he was in a public park, so the building became more of a kind of simple box-like structure. But it used the same idea of a single distorted membrane to contain all of the spaces, the circulation spaces, the lobbies, the auditorium, all within this single concrete membrane. And then the exterior facades of the building it was as if we were looking at a cross-section through a piece of coral or a piece of bone. And Ito wanted these exterior facades to be somehow permeable. Light and air can move through these facades in a filtered way. And he says this is a re-examination of the lessons of traditional Japanese architecture. So, fairly easy to make a computer model of the concept, quite difficult to make a physical model of the concept, and extremely difficult to build the actual architecture. Extraordinary work in producing the rebar. But this is a test piece. This is not the actual building. They were testing that the system would work on site as proof of concept. So here you see Ito on site. To the left of him in this photo, there is a vertical column. That's temporary. That's there until all of the concrete shell sets. Once the shell is rigid, that column can be taken away and it's entirely self-supporting. So here we have Ito's futuristic architecture that learns the lessons of permeability and translucency from traditional Japanese architecture. That is his updated version of architecture for the virtual information world that also learns lessons from the physical, natural world. And if anyone's ever been here, you will know that the spaces are fairly extraordinary. Now, but in between winning the competition and completing the building, which took 10 years, this happened. On the 11th of March 2011, Japan was hit by the 4th largest earthquake in recorded history. It caused an enormous tsunami that swept across the coastline, wiping out entire cities. Tens of thousands of people were killed. And the scene looked like the aftermath of a war. So at this moment, it caused a great deal of soul searching in the Japanese architectural community. Ito himself became very involved in the reconstruction efforts. Just after the disaster, there was an enormous exhibition held in Tokyo on the 50th anniversary of metabolism, and the surviving metabolists were on stage discussing whether or not metabolism from 1960 might have something to offer the reconstruction of Tohoku after the earthquake. Perhaps the ideas of metabolism now can find their true application. Arata Isozaki was not a metabolist, but he was in the front row when they were saying these things, and he stood up and said, "You are all fools. Metabolism has absolutely nothing to offer the reconstruction of Tohoku. We must work in a much more subtle, delicate way, not the kind of technological megalomania of metabolism." Ito's Sendai Mediatek was damaged, but the damage was superficial. It was only the surface finishes. The structure was flexible enough to survive, and the building was perfectly reconstructed. But Ito himself started working with the local community, and he assembled a team of Japan's most avant-garde architects to start producing fairly humble, simple buildings to assist in the reconstruction. This was the second building he completed, together with the younger architects Kumiko Inui, So Fujimoto, and Akihisa Hirata. And the house is distinguished, as you can see, by these vertical tree trunks. These are trees that were knocked down by the tsunami. So the house itself contains the physical memory of the disaster. You can see the tree trunks shown here in orange. And since then, Ito and his team have continued to produce buildings for Tohoku. They still do so today. The following year at the Venice Architecture Biennale, Ito exhibited the work he was doing for Tohoku, and the title of the exhibition was A Poignant Question, Is Architecture Possible Here? Home for All, which was the name of the group he established. So they brought over tree trunks from Tohoku to install in the pavilion, the Japan Pavilion, and showed the models of the development of the design. That's the team of architects who did that house I just showed. So since then, Home for All has been building humble architecture that, in a certain sense, is a much more direct, subtle, responsive attempt to create, let's say, a metabolic architecture for the Tohoku region that looks nothing like the metabolism of 1960, but maintains some of the same principles of creating an architecture that can grow and change in response to the needs of the people who will use it. So I will finish there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I use them? Thank you very much, Thomas. Eu vou chamar os nossos participantes aqui, a professora Margareth e Pereira.
Assim ficamos mais perto.
Would you like me to sit?
Well, it's up to you. Whether you sit, yeah, maybe here, that,
Over here.
yeah, that's fine. E professor Rodrigo Kamimura, por favor. Obrigado. Vou oferecer ao público primeiro as perguntas. Tá? Bom, muito obrigado, professor Thomas, pela palestra, incrível palestra. Eu queria primeiro abrir as perguntas do público. Se alguém tiver perguntas, fique à vontade. Você tem?
Não tenho pais aí de famílias. Tem.
Ah, tem ali, né? Tem microfone aí? Tem outro legal.
Isso.
Boa tarde. Posso perguntar em português? Obrigado. Eu queria entender um pouco mais como ele explicaria essa mudança da visão japonesa entre a reconstrução tecnológica do metabolismo e depois uma reconstrução mais sensível depois do tsunami, um olhar mais menos, como é que eu posso dizer, menos utópico, né? E mais sensibilizado sobre a realidade japonesa. Obrigado.
Quotes. And then now we have a more sensitive architecture explained about the Tohoku tsunami, the tsunami in Tohoku, right? Do you understand? How can we explore it? Yeah, because there are two moments, right? So one more technological, and now you have a more sensitive approach. And so, what is the... Yeah? In English? Yeah? Well, me corrija se eu estiver errado, mas I think he wants to know how you can explain these two moments in the Japanese architecture. One more technological during the metabolist phase, and now just after the post-tsunami, I mean, at Tohoku, right? And how can you compare these two moments?
Well, I hope that the lecture did exactly that. But yes, in a sense, there are two moments. One is a response to the war, and one is a response to the disaster of 2011. But at the same time, this is also a continuity, a gradation, a gradual shift in thinking. And perhaps it can be best explained in terms of the shift from hardware to software. Technology in terms of mechanical systems and technological objects, and a shift to softer IT, virtual systems that allows this kind of new approach to happen. So the shift to computers rather than mechanical objects, I think, is part of the reason. There was also the simple fact that in the 1960s and the 1950s, megastructures, capsules, and so on were being explored all over the world, not just in Japan. And that period of experimentation, I think, showed everyone that it didn't really work, that prefabrication in architecture was extremely limited and often unsuccessful, that we needed a more agile, flexible way of responding to things. And I think that's what we see in the Tohoku reconstruction.
Mais alguém? Você leva para ele?
Pergunta em inglês ou em português? Hello, you showed several examples of kind of floating architecture, either in the air or on the water. But I wanted to ask if the metabolists, if they ever considered what was happening at ground level, at sea level, or underwater in their projects, or if they completely ignored that.
Well, of course, the projects that were on the sea were on the water. They were floating platforms on the water. But the sea is open tabula rasa, so it didn't really matter. Arata Isuzaki's big criticism of metabolist ideas is that they didn't think about the existing city or the existing situation. So his projects were a way to show how you could make metabolism think about the existing city with his joint, rather than a rigid grid that doesn't care about the tabula rasa below it. His joint core was a way of responding in a very delicate way to the existing situation. So I think it's true that the metabolists themselves didn't really think about the context, and Isozaki tried to show them how they might do it.
Speak. At the person.
Hi. Since he asked about the ground level, I want to hear more about the underground level, because I'm really interested in these kinds of constructions, and I want to know if the metabolists ever considered the underground level. I know they didn't consider the ground level since you say that, but I want to know about the underground and stuff like that. Thank you.
A pergunta was about
A gente vai voltar às perguntas.
Could you explain the flexibility of the new proposal of housing now after tsunami, please?
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I think you showed a very technological society and that influences architecture. And I really enjoyed this shift you just told us about hardware to software. I kind of teach software, and I want to ask you about soft architecture nowadays. Is this how do you see it?
Deixa eu passar, né? Senão são muitas perguntas. Já vou passar, mas aí já foram 4, né?
So first of all, as far as I know, the metabolists never made any underground proposals, because that would mean they would have to deal with the existing city to penetrate through it. They always wanted to be separated from the existing city, so they went up into the air or out into the sea, and they didn't touch the ground or go under the ground. In terms of the flexibility of the new projects, it's not a flexibility in the sense of, let's say, modular construction or prefabrication. It's the ability to work with the resources that they find at exactly the place they are, with the tree trunks, with demolition materials, and so on, to incorporate that into the construction, the new construction, not to bring materials from a long way away, but to work with what they find. And I didn't spend time explaining the projects in detail, but for example, there was a children's center designed by Maki Onishi as part of the redevelopment. The buildings are on wheels. She decided children could play anywhere, so she made a children's center where all of the separate small parts of the building can move around, be reconfigured into an entirely new combination of elements. So that was a very direct example of flexibility. But the architecture is not flexible in the sense of moving parts so much as more agile in the way of responding to what is found there, rather than just imposing some system of capsules from above. Then in terms of soft architecture, well, I think that everywhere in the world, the incorporation of information technology and new software possibilities is a very large topic in the architectural world. In Japan, we have a famous group called Team Lab, which I think they're now internationally quite well known, which are very involved in creating virtual environments, responsive virtual environments, where rather than just being immersed in some kind of video projection fantasy, sensors of various types respond to the movement and activities of people in the spaces, and the space will apparently will appear to change. So this is exactly the kind of technology available now that would have been perfect for the Expo in 1970, and now we're seeing it, the dreams of Expo 70 becoming possible due to the technology today. So I think that often the people who lead, who show us the direction that the technology enables are often artists, media artists who find new technologies and therefore new ways to use them that the inventors of the technology didn't, are media artists, and then they often will collaborate with architects to find a new direction. So this is what Toyo Ito wanted to do in 1971, and this is what is truly happening now with people such as Team Lab.
Sim, embaixo.
So you talked about how the Metabolists were from the 60s and 70s, and at the same time in the West, it was mostly the majority of architects were already criticizing this idea of utopian planning. And what was their relation to the Metabolists? Because the Metabolists were very utopian in creating those huge projects and that.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was great. I want to know if, for example, during the nowadays climate changes, especially floodings, for example, what happened here in Brazil, in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, how we, as Western cultures, especially the poorest countries, can have this change in architecture, such as happened with the Japanese culture during and after the tsunami. Thank you.
So you mentioned how in the rest of the world, like in the 60s and a bit before as well, other architects and other countries were already thinking about this kind of megastructure and utopian architecture. So like thinking about tabula rasa, and I wanted to know what are the main points that differ the Japanese, like the, what's the name? It's the Metabolists from like the rest of the architects from the rest of the world that were also thinking about kind of ignoring the city below and building everything from scratch.
Thomas, so thank you very much. It was just like listening to you. It was just like a story, just very nicely told. It was excellent. Thank you very much. So I was wondering how this metabolist thinking was from parts going to the whole. And then at the same time in Brazil, we had very much modernism and all this. And we were very much fixed on the whole and not very much in the parts. And how these parts in the metabolist, as they make the whole, they get weak. And then nowadays, they get into the parts again. So I don't know if you thought about this. So I was just thinking, because this movement, what was happening in Japan and what was happening here, and how this circulation of ideas in the field of architecture, because some of the works we see of post-metabolists and everything, they remind us very much of Oscar Niemeyer. So I don't know how you see this. I was just wondering. Thank you.
Okay. These are all very, very interesting issues. In a sense, the first and the third question were both similar questions about utopia or the failure of utopia. During the 1950s, you had architects such as Paul Rudolph and Louis Kahn looking at modular megastructural construction systems. And the metabolists were learning lessons from them. Now, you have to remember, in 1960, there was no internet. Publications were not, were difficult to get. They had to be imported. There was a language barrier. They didn't have access to that much information. But they knew about Louis Kahn, they knew about Paul Rudolph, and in the beginning of the 1960s, a very strong relationship developed between the metabolists and Archigram. Now, Archigram, if you look at many of their early projects, for the plug-in city, for example, it looks almost exactly like a metabolist project. But the Archigram drawings are colorful and funny and ridiculous and full of pop culture jokes. The metabolist drawings were black and white, serious, without jokes, without pop culture, because Archigram didn't really believe they were going to build things. They just wanted to provoke and challenge the establishment of architecture. The metabolists thought they were really going to build those things. Japan truly needed to be reconstructed. The government was interested in what the metabolists were doing. The general public was interested in the metabolists. It truly seemed like metabolist ideas were actually going to be built at an enormous scale. They weren't doing visionary utopian projects. They seriously thought they were going to rebuild Japan. Paul Rudolph and Louis Kahn and Archigram, Archizoom, Super Studio, and so on, they were having fun. They were trying to be provocative, but they were utopianist. The metabolists were serious. Finally, it didn't really happen in that way, but it was intended to be a serious construction, not utopian fantasies. Now, the second question was about, remind me, who asked the second question? About what? About the climate crisis. Yes, so your question is how do we in Western countries respond to the climate crisis? I simply have no answer to that question. I would only say that, first of all, architects are much less powerful than you might hope. We hope that we change the world. Somebody else is paying for it. Unless we convince them, it doesn't get built. So you have to convince a client that it's worth making climate-conscious architecture, and they won't do that unless they're going to save money. If you can show them that better insulation and so on will save money in running costs, they will do it. If you ask them to spend a lot of money for the public good, they will not. So architects, through competitions and exhibitions, can suggest ideas. Then you need the government to make legislation. For example, in most countries, you must use double glazing. No client would ever use double glazing unless the government told them it was the law. Or you did a calculation that said you will save money in the long term. No client will do it just because it's the right thing to do. So we push for legislation and we try and convince clients that it's good for them in every possible way. But if I had an answer to that question, I would like to hear someone else give the answer to that question, but I don't have a real answer. And then, I'm sorry, just... Nehemiah. So the issue of formalism versus kind of non-formalism, this is super interesting. So some of the metabolists were very formalist. You saw the big cubes and diamonds and trees and so on. But there was another aspect to metabolism. Fumihiko Maki and Masato Otaka developed a concept they called group form. And group form was specifically about the part creating the whole. You didn't begin with the whole, you began with the elements that would then responsively, interactively emerge into the larger form. So Maki, I hope everybody knows Maki's name. He's a very famous architect who died very recently. He criticized the metabolists for he was a metabolist, but he criticized the other metabolists for being too formalist and too concerned with the composition. He wanted the composition to be spontaneous. I didn't have time to explain his work, but this is a very good question. That was the big dichotomy in metabolism, part versus whole.
Richard, não sei se eu quero fazer uma pergunta para ele. Posso fazer? Bom, vou fazer em português. Você traduz? Well, I'll try to speak English. I read your book, particularly Anatomy of the Influence. And I think, or you'd like, or maybe you could also talk for us and for our students also the political condition in this metabolistic moment, because we have groups that were Marxist, we have groups that were Trotskyist, and anarchists also, provocative ones. And then maybe for the audience and for our students that till now didn't have the occasion to read you, can you speak a little more for us? Thank you.
Yes, that's a huge topic. Of course, architecture doesn't happen in a vacuum. The point of the book that you mentioned, An Anatomy of Influence, was to show the way that architectural ideas were emerging in a much wider climate of culture and technology and economics and international politics. So the metabolists emerged at a moment. Well, the metabolists existed for 10 years, from 1960 to 1970. And that was a period of terrible political crisis in Japan. There were riots in the streets. Literally millions of people were involved in anti-government demonstrations. Part of that was to do with the relationship between Japan and the United States, which was becoming very close, and some people didn't like that. And partly the Expo, which I discussed in detail in 1970, was seen by many people as propaganda, trying to show a particular image of Japan that was not correct, and also involved displacing farmers whose land was used for the Expo grounds. And also, very importantly, the Expo was powered by Japan's first nuclear reactor. That was a very uncomfortable fact for many Japanese people as citizens of the only country ever to be attacked by nuclear weapons. And of course, 50 years later, in the Tohoku disaster, that as well as the tsunami, there was a nuclear meltdown. So the metabolists arose in a climate of major political protest and crisis, of people trying to attack the government. There was terrorism in Japan, and now Japan is a very peaceful place. Their protest really doesn't exist, and Toyo Ito has said, the young students who graduate and come into his office, he says they have no passion because they have nothing to protest, nothing to be angry about.
Shane.
Thomas, I would like to thank you for the presentation. I would like to thank everyone here. And I didn't prepare a question for you, but hearing you speak, I wrote 4 things that I think we could think about. These are 4 questions that I often think about because my master thesis was about Archigram and Superstudio and Archizone and the international situationists. And then when we compare this to the Brazilian architecture, I have 4 things that make me upset. That the first is the question of siderurgy. I don't know if in English siderurgy is the how can I say in English, siderurgia? Well, I think that the concrete and steel economic activity that explore the material in Brazil, it was with oil extraction. It's a very important question to understand how these questions were developed by the architects and how the real possibilities of making these projects were being defeated or being succeeded. And I would like to understand economic activity in Japan in this sense. And the second question, I think it's the institutions, because we have, in case of London, for example, a student spirit of revolt, of rebellion against old-fashioned considered forms of learning or teaching, which led the students to make magazines like Arquitetura and the Metabolistas, paper magazines, cheap magazines. In Brazil, we had a magazine called Arquitetura in Rio de Janeiro, which was published during the 60s, and it was a magazine of the Instituto de Arquitetos do Brasil, Brazilian Architects Institute, which were cheap also and provocative in some questions, some ideas. And the fourth question concerns to the question of the communication, like the radio, like the Marshall McLuhan books, the television transmissions, which were the main channel which work culture circulated among European and United States and Japan, etc. I think that these four questions are some preoccupations that I have about the theme. I don't know if it's exactly questions, but I think there's some 4 points to think about.
If it was a question, what's the question?
4 questions. The steel and concrete industry, the institutions and revolt against institutions.
The question is,
how was the climate in Japanese in this sense, economic and institutional sense?
So if you are talking about the period in the late 50s and 1960s, in terms of the Japanese economy, it was booming, partly because of the war in Korea. Japan was making a lot of money selling goods to the American military for clothing and so on. And Japan itself was developing very fast. All of the rural areas were becoming industrial areas, and this caused huge problems for traditional fishing and farming, and caused terrible problems with industrial pollution, and was killing people. There were birth defects. There was rural areas were being poisoned with mercury and cadmium and all kinds of industrial waste. And it was in 1971, I think, where the government finally, in response to grassroots protests, set up an environmental agency in the government to stop the pollution and the destruction of the natural environment. So Japan developed too fast and too thoughtlessly, and caused a tremendous amount of damage to the natural environment and to the people. But by the 1970s, they were trying to solve that problem and return to a more eco-friendly way of life that is more in keeping with traditional Japanese culture.
Posso só falar uma coisa? May I say something? Fabiana brought us this two aspects. I mean, she talked about the whole and the parts. And, well, the definition of megastructure is a large framework where we plug in some parts, maybe in an endless way. I mean, we can grow the building as much as we can. And so I think maybe the let's say, I don't know if it's too strong to say the failure of the megastructure maybe it's based on these 2 points. One, because you have to prepare this large framework to receive different plug-in items, right? Like you don't know if you want to build in that way or that way, so you have to be prepared to grow the building as much as you can. And the second is that it's like a, let's say, up-down movement, right? So because even saying that, well, someone can work with the unity, it's not the person who's not the person who will live there, who will deal with the parts, but someone who is responsible for the whole. So I think it's quite natural to have people like Fumihiko Maki questioning the formalism. And even I brought here a statement by Kisho Kurokawa that in the 90s he wrote, technology does not take root when it's cut off from culture and tradition. So it's quite ironically, because after 30 years he said something like this, because his architecture was so based on the technology, right? Especially in the capsules and things like this. So it's not a question, it was just a talk. If you want to talk about my talk, it's okay.
This is very interesting, and I realize one of the earlier questions I didn't answer properly, which was, how did the Metabolists distinguish themselves from what the other architects in the West were doing, which was also about megastructure and capsules and so on. And the Metabolists tried to explain their work in Japanese terms and in Buddhist terms. Buddhism is not a Japanese religion, it's from India, but it's become the main religion of Japan. And the idea is that nothing is permanent. Everything changes, everything must be replaced, everything flows. So the idea of building pyramids out of stone and they will last forever is the opposite of the Japanese way of building something out of wood that has to be replaced in 20 years, such that the Japanese even ritualize the fact of cyclical wooden construction. They will replace parts even when they don't have to, in a kind of ritualistic way. So the idea of architecture having a metabolism of growth and change might have been a radical new idea in a Western situation of cities made of stone and brick, but somehow fit very well with Japanese tradition in terms of architecture made of wood that was already modular. Traditional Japanese architecture uses tatami mats and shoji screens, things that are always the same dimension. You can go down to the second-hand shop and buy some more tatami mats and screens, and you know they will fit into your house because everything is based on the same dimensionally coordinated elements. So the idea of a kind of flexible formalism emerged very naturally in terms of modern Japanese architecture.
Could you talk a little for us also about little utopias and the everyday life, because I didn't read you very well, but in the same time of Metabolist movement, we have also a movement that looks back to the vernacular, also everyday life scale, and utopia. And there's this word very, very important for us Brazilian, because utopia was right by Moros looking for the Portuguese in Brazil. And then we have also this idea of utopia as a kind of determinant. You use this word also, and maybe you can develop a little more for us your idea, because I'm not sure if I read you correctly.
I think that all architecture and urbanism is utopian. If you're not trying to make the world a better place, what are you doing? So every gesture you make as a designer and as a thinker in the world of architecture and urbanism is a step towards utopia, a step towards making the world a better place, even though utopia itself is the asymptote that you never reach. That should always be your goal. So it's not a case of utopian versus non-utopian thinking. It's simply pointing out that who would be so cynical as to design and build without thinking they're trying to make the world better?
Thank you so much.
A gente vai fazer uma última rodada e aí a gente vai encerrar, tá bom? Meu bloco. Pode.
Hi. Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I was wondering a little bit about, you talked about rhizomes and trying to understand and comprehend the city as sort of tree and this hierarchical way of thinking. And I was wondering a little bit about the co-implications of trying to understand the urban planning and the city and the connections of the city as rhizomes and also as the tree that you mentioned back in the day during the metabolism time period and also nowadays, and sort of the co-implications of trying to understand and comprehend the city that way. Thank you.
My question actually comes from an answer you gave, I think it was Fabiana, and she spoke about how sometimes we focus too much on the overall and we forget about the particular, the small things, and how other metabolists criticize themselves for not being spontaneous. And sometimes it tends to happen to us, and mostly because we have to sort of go down this pattern whereby we are creating, but even though we are creating, we already know what we are creating because it has been pre-established. So I would like to ask you to give us like a tip, a hint on how we can create without ignoring all this creativity side of the architecture, but in combining it with the patterns that we are already used to follow. For example, you're going to build a house. You know what a house has to have, but you want to bring up something new, even though you already know what a house has to have. I mean, the spontaneity that we're talking about, and how can we get attached to it without forgetting what it has to be done?
Hi. You said that some Japanese architects, when planning cities, try to include some different visions to plan it, trying to not only one architect plan all. So think about it. How you see the involvement of Japanese people in this plan of cities, looking more for the normal people, not the architect, the engineering. Yeah, this is my question.
Hello. One of the most important ideas of metabolism movement was to expand construction beyond land into the water or air. Considering that Brazil already has some construction on water in coastal areas and over-constructed on big cities, do you think it makes sense to explore marine-based structure today, similar to Kikutaki's floating platform for the 1976 Expo, one of the real-life experiment of the metabolism? Sorry. What I want to know is if this idea of construction on water still makes sense in our days.
Thank you for very different and interesting questions. So the first question was about the idea of the tree versus the rhizome or rhizome. I hope everyone understands the word rhizome in terms of a kind of a mesh or a web of connections where there's no real hierarchy, no trunk to branch to twig to leaf, but rather all kinds of equally important elements connected in multiple ways. So there's a very famous essay by Christopher Alexander titled "A City is Not a Tree," and it's an old essay from the 60s, and it precisely makes this point that to think of the city in terms of a hierarchy of the main trunk down to the smaller, finer elements really doesn't make sense. A city is much more complicated in terms of being a mesh of elements without such a clear hierarchy. And above all, a city needs to have redundancy. If one street gets blocked, if something collapses, there always has to be secondary routes or other alternative routes that are not secondary, that are equally primary. A city survives because it's redundant. That's the resilience of a city. So what Isozaki was trying to do was to, in fact, this is a long theoretical argument, but precisely what Isozaki was doing was saying, a city is not a tree, a city is a rhizome, and demonstrating that through his version of metabolist projects in the 1960s and in his later city schemes from the 90s and beyond. In terms of, I think I'm not sure if I understood fully the second question in terms of the relationship between preserving tradition and convention and exploring new things. There's no single answer to that, except that it's a case-by-case response based on the intelligence and talents of the architect in terms of finding the correct balance. I do like the metaphor of Ram Koolhaas, which is that the contemporary urbanist or architect is a surfer. The city is a wave, and the surfer has to find a way to negotiate that wave in a beautiful, elegant, successful way without falling off. Sanford Quinter, the theorist, has talked about pastoralism, where the architect or urbanist is a farmer who is guiding sheep. You can't fully control the sheep, but you can guide them somehow into the place and the combination and the configuration that you want. It comes down to the intelligence and talents of the architect and what the client is willing to put up with, but certainly architects cannot be fully avant-garde and completely forget the past. They always have to have a deep understanding of the past in order to accept it or reject it or find a way to build onto it. There was a question about whether building on the sea, building on the water still means something today. Again, there's no answer to that question except for what's the specific case that we're talking about. There are those who believe that climate change is causing the sea levels to rise. There are those who believe that's not true. Certainly some of the loudest voices saying that the sea levels are rising are still buying very expensive oceanfront properties, so I don't know what they really believe. But I personally love architecture that faces directly onto the water. There are places I've seen in Colombia, where I've never been, which has beautiful architecture on the water. Certainly in Japan, outside Kyoto, there's a place called Ine, where all of the houses have, much like Venice, they directly project into the water. You can bring your boat into your house. I think this is a beautiful way to live. If the climate allows it, if you're not in danger of tsunami too often, or flooding and storms, I think that a human relationship to land, to the forest, and to the sea is a beautiful way to live. If it's at all possible, I would strongly encourage building on the water, but not necessarily in that kind of high-tech overbearing way that we saw in some of the Metabolist projects. Now, I'm sorry, there was a third question there. Please just remind me what it was.
It was about this.
So yes, this is a very good question. So in Japan, people are very involved in the city, but not in a coordinated way. In Japan, possibly in all of East Asia, if you own a land, that's almost a sacred thing. It's you feel like you have the right to build anything you want on your land as long as it doesn't physically affect the neighbors, like cast too much shadow on the neighbors or block the neighbors somehow. You should not have any control on the aesthetics of what you build or how you build it. So that's why, if you've ever been to Japan, the cities look like a complete mess. Every building has no relationship to the buildings around it. It's very exciting. But if you go to a great European city, there's amazing, in the streets of Paris or Amsterdam and so on, you see this amazing kind of harmony between the buildings. The irony is that Westerners think we are very individualistic. The cities look like everyone's the same. The Japanese think we are very collective and not individualistic. The cities look like everyone's an individual. So what that means is that in Japan, every person has their say in what the city looks like, but it's very difficult to make overall coordinated master plans. It's very hard to kick people out of their homes for some new infrastructure development. People have such strong power if they own the land. And that means the city is very individualistic. Aesthetically, it's kind of a mess. And large-scale urban planning is very difficult to achieve. So a lot of the urban planning in Japan is tabula rasa in the areas that were once suburbs or rural areas. There was some major developments in Tokyo. It took them 20 years just to assemble all of the land because there would still be a few little old people who just refused to sell their house at any price, and they had to wait them out, and eventually they were able to collect enough land to build something. Or cases where, for example, a train station was, a rail yard was closed down and suddenly there was a big piece of land, or a self-defense forces base was closed down and there was a big piece of land. But the Japanese city is strangely individualistic despite Japan being very collective.
Thank you. So, question in summary? No? No. Okay. So, thank you very much, Thomas. It was an honor to have you here. And so, então, obrigado a todos. E a gente encerra aqui a parte final do evento de uma semana dos 80 anos. Né? Uhum. Yes. Let's go to samba, né?
Eu queria mesmo agradecer a todos vocês por estarem aqui. This was really more than honor. It was a pleasure to hear again for me, but was really helpful, I think, for many people here. A gente vai ter às 2h daqui a pouquinho uma roda de samba no hall e aí sim, com isso encerraremos a semana de festividades, tá bom? Estão todos convidados. E mais uma vez, muito obrigado por participarem aqui do Bicentenário.